Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, sanctions. Western powers threatened, but when push came to shove, they didn't follow through. So in the end, has Vladimir Putin won in Crimea? Also this week, more on South Africa. We've talked about unemployment before. Now the trains and a massive infrastructure project which could create thousands of jobs. And robots in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the homegrown technology that could replace police officers, but still needs police officers to protect it. All that to come, but we're starting with Russia again this week, a nation which apparently no one wants to really tangle with in the wake of the Ukraine-Crimea crisis, despite a whole lot of big talk. Because really the threat of sanctions has come and gone. Vladimir Putin appears ambivalent whilst threatening consequences. The West looks weak and impotent, largely because of Europe's dependence on Russian oil and gas and the way it's tied the hands of both Brussels and Washington. In fact, let's start with that. Look at how much the EU paid Russia for oil and gas back in 2012, over $156 billion. That accounts for almost a third of Europe's energy supply right there. You've got financial trade. If the EU and the US stop trading with Russian banks, the Russian economy could be hit to the tune of $50 billion a quarter. And that's the former Russian finance minister, Alexei Kudrin, saying that. And you know, money's already on the move in retaliation. There are reports more than $100 billion in Russian money has been shifted out of the United States in the last week, which is about 80% of Russia's $138 billion in US Treasury and bond holdings. And that reaction raises some interesting scenarios in other countries as to how Russia may react if further threatened. Now, according to the Bank of International Settlements, US banks and asset managers have about $75 billion of exposure to Russia. Russia could instruct its companies to default on loans to the West. The Financial Times claims 300,000 German jobs could be lost if there are tit-for-tat sanctions. And Bloomberg reports Russian companies have made $180 billion in deals in just the past 2 years, deals which have provided profits to bankers and lawyers in the City of London. Initially, though, all sides seemed to be content with name-calling and accusations. Like this, an exchange between the Russian and US ambassadors to the United Nations earlier in the week, which really sums up how futile all the attempts at political and economic sanctions had been that far.
We have taken note of the reaction of a number of our Western partners who simply cannot rid themselves of the imperial colonial habits of attempting to impose their writ on other peoples and countries.
A thief can steal property, but that does not confer the right of ownership on the thief. In closing, Madam President, let me just emphasize again what Russia has done is wrong as a matter of law, wrong as a matter of history, wrong as a matter of policy, and dangerous.
Мы категорически не приемлем оскорбительных
It
высказываний.
is simply unacceptable to listen to these insults addressed to our country. If the US delegation expects our cooperation in the Security Council on other issues, then Ambassador Power must understand this quite clearly.
So basically, he's talking about consequences there, which takes us back to this sanctions issue. Here's Paddy Culhane now to take us through what the United States had laid down by the end of the week.
Before flying out of Washington for an event in Florida, President Barack Obama stopped to send a message to Russian President Vladimir Putin. His closest friends could pay the price for Russia's annexing of Crimea, adding a total of 20 Russians and a bank to the U.S. sanctions list. Most are politicians, but a few of Putin's wealthy friends also made the list, including Vladimir Yakunin, the chairman of the Russian-owned railway, Yuri Kovalchuk, the largest single shareholder of Bank Rosia, and Arkady and Boris Rotenberg, businessmen who received $7 billion worth of contracts for the Sochi Olympics. The U.S. president promised they would feel an impact, but warned if the Russian military moves into eastern or southern Ukraine, the Russian economy will be next.
This is not our preferred outcome. These sanctions would not only have a significant impact on the Russian economy, but could also be disruptive to the global economy.
Senior administration officials tell me that could include the mining, financial services, and defense industries. Economists say threatening individuals probably won't really hurt Putin, but threatening the Russian economy just might have an impact on his thinking.
That's what creates the uncertainty, because it shows the U.S. willingness to do this with its European allies, and that would have further sanctions would have the potential to materially damage the Russian economy.
Russia responded by banning 9 Americans from traveling to Russia, including Speaker of the House John Boehner, 2 of Obama's closest aides, Dan Pfeiffer and Ben Rhodes, and senators like Robert Menendez, all of them brushing off this tit for tat. The president has ruled out using military force over Ukraine, downplaying the likelihood the U.S. will even provide lethal military assistance to the country. But he is sending a warning. Any moves by Russia which threaten the NATO countries is a different story.
We've already increased our support for our Eastern European allies, and we will continue to strengthen NATO's collective defense.
But his final message as he walked away, diplomacy can work, but Russia has to stop at Crimea.
So, sanctions, can they be effective here? Is there any point in pursuing this line, really? Let's ask Bill Browder. He's the CEO of Hermitage Capital Management, which was actually set up to invest in Russia back in 1996. Bill is a man who, if I can put it this way, Bill, you've fallen foul of Russian politics before, just so our viewers know. Banned from Russia, treated as a threat to national security. Given your experiences, what lengths do you think Russian politicians would go to if they're prodded with the sanction stick any further?
Well, I should give you a small bit of background on my story. I was once the largest investor in the country. The Russians expelled me after I exposed corruption. They then raided my offices, seized all of our companies, and then I hired a young lawyer to investigate what was going on. He discovered they stole $230 million of taxes that we paid to the Russian government. He testified about it. His name was Sergei Magnitsky. He was then arrested, tortured, and killed in prison. And then the Russian government, right up to Vladimir Putin, covered up his death. We then fought for sanctions against the people who did this, and the United States passed something named after my lawyer. It's called the Magnitsky Act, which sanctioned the people who killed him. The Russians retaliated by banning American adoptions of Russian orphans, effectively killing some of their orphans because those kids needed medical attention in the United States, killing them in order to protect corrupt officials in Russia. So what this tells you is that there's nothing that Vladimir Putin and his inner circle will stop at in their whole escalation with the rest of the world. I've had a micro experience with this, but what I can tell you is that these people are complete gangsters. Any weakness that we show in the West, they'll take advantage of, and they're not stopping with Crimea.
However, sanctions seem to be the way that the West wants to go, despite how limited they are and the fact that they really end up, or can end up, just being a sort of a pinprick on a major political system. Now, look, I've seen a tweet going around this week. It's like a picture, this flow chart, which shows people like the head of Gazprom and the head of Russian railways and how they're all linked to the Kremlin and how, well, in the belief of this tweet, they're the ones who should be targeted. Would that work, going after them? Can sanctions be effective?
I believe very strongly that sanctions are the best tool at the moment. And the reason for that is that the Russian regime, the Putin regime, is much different than the Soviet regime of 35 years ago in that these guys have all gotten rich, really rich, richer than we could all ever imagine. And they've never felt comfortable keeping their money in Russia. They keep it in the West. They have huge houses in Knightsbridge. They have villas in the south of France. They have big bank accounts in Switzerland, London, France, America, and because they're so rich, that's our leverage. We don't have to send troops into Ukraine to stop these people. We have to freeze their assets. But the sanctions lists that have been put together so far freeze the assets of bit players, people that are not significant in this whole situation. In order for the sanctions to work, they have to go after Putin's inner circle. And so my recommendation to any policymaker about this whole situation is they should sanction the cabinet ministers of Putin's regime, and they should sanction the oligarch trustees, the oligarchs who hold assets on their behalf. And if they were to do that, that would stop Putin in his tracks in a split second.
But haven't you actually highlighted an inherent problem here? I mean, you've just explained to us how Russians have got all this money and property and the like all over the world. If you go after these people, if you sanction them, if you freeze their assets, that will affect businesses and economies all over the world. And maybe that's why people don't want to go after the Russians so much.
It's entirely correct that the Russians are not going to, they will retaliate, and there will be economic costs. The real question is, how much money is it worth to us to have global security, to not have a third world war, because that's what it's going to come to if we don't stop them right now. If Putin is allowed to take over Crimea without any consequences, he'll go to eastern Ukraine. If he gets into eastern Ukraine without any consequences, he'll go to the Baltics. At that point, NATO will fall apart. He'll grab a few of the Central Asian countries at the same time. How much do we want to allow to happen before we say enough is enough? We can't allow another Hitler kind of situation to be affecting all of us in this century. And so, if there's an economic cost, I guarantee you that economic cost of Russia's retaliation on sanctions will be a lot less than what the cost will be if we allow him to go forward and do what he's planning to do right now.
Okay, so if it is as bad as you're outlining here, then who has to step up? Is it the European Union, which is perhaps in the best position, or perhaps actually in a bad position because we know it is so dependent on Russia for oil and gas? But, is it perhaps the biggest group that really needs to step up here?
Well, I think the United States, the European Union, Canada, Australia, basically all the civilized countries of the world have to act in unison and sanction Putin's cabinet ministers. If they do that, I believe that will give Putin big pause in what he's doing right now, because that's the one place where we have leverage, and that's one place where it's relatively costless leverage compared to all the other options. Ideally, we don't want a trade war with Russia. We don't want to have to cut off their energy, and we don't want to have to cut off everything else, because there's 140 million Russian citizens that have nothing to do with this. This is Vladimir Putin's adventure, not the Russian people's adventure. And so if we can, it's like a modern cancer drug. If you can kill the cancer by just going after the specific cancer cells, that's the equivalent of what targeted sanctions would do here. But they have to be going after the cancer cells, not some other random cells.
It's quite an analogy there. Bill, you used the phrase there that this is Vladimir Putin's adventure, not the adventure of his people. What is that adventure, in your opinion? What exactly is he trying to achieve with all of this?
Well, Vladimir Putin started his whole career as a head of state by starting a war. In other words, he became the president of Russia by starting a vicious war in Chechnya. And he understands the value of war when it comes to popularity and leadership. Now, over the last 14 years, Putin's star has risen and fallen and risen and fallen, but he's now in a pretty tough position, or he has been in a pretty tough position, because the economy hasn't been growing, the average Russian is not getting better off, the corruption is off the charts, and people were starting to get angry. And he saw what happened to Yanukovych in Ukraine, and he said to himself, I don't want this to happen to me. And so what's the best way of making sure that he doesn't get deposed? Starts a war. And he started a war, which means that, and he's gotten popular. His approval ratings have jumped dramatically in the last few days since he started this war. And he will keep at this war because that's the way he stays in power. And so anyone who thinks that somehow we can negotiate with him to back down, this is not about the West negotiating with him. This is about the West using whatever leverage we can, because he needs this war to stay in power, and he needs to stay in power to keep his money. And if we can go after his money, that's the one way we can stop him.
Bill Browder with his unique insight there into Russian politics. Bill, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And still ahead on Counting the Cost, made by the Women's Technology Cooperative in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the robots that keep the road users moving and create some much needed jobs. We've covered South Africa a lot on this program, a country that offers so much promise but still struggles to create jobs. In fact, unemployment is still up around 25%. The thing is, President Jacob Zuma made a big promise. He said 5 million jobs would be created. And to be fair, there is some movement there. We're going to tell you about Transnet, the state-owned rail company which plans to spend $5 billion on new diesel and electric locomotives. Now, the contracts have gone out to Chinese, American and British companies, but it's expected the investment will create more than 500,000 jobs in South Africa over the next 7 years, all part of the government's plan to invest in infrastructure projects to drive growth. Anoj Singh is Transnet's Chief Financial Officer. He's joining us from Johannesburg to talk us through this huge infrastructure investment. Anoj, can you give us the background into why you're doing this? What is the end game here? What is, the result you're hoping to get from investing all of this money in rail infrastructure?
Well, firstly, there has been a significant historic underspending in rolling stock, particularly in South Africa, for probably the last 20 years or so. The last time that we actually had any augmentation or any sort of new rolling stock was probably first time in 2008, and this is the next significant acquisition of rolling stock for the railway network. The end game, as you put it, is basically to reach a 180 million ton general freight business from the current 80 million tons. So it's a significant increase in capacity for the general freight business where these particular locomotives will be deployed.
Right, you say rolling stock, so you're talking about the vast wealth of mineral resources and natural resources that South Africa is blessed with, and I guess making the most of all of those resources.
Sure, it is, and also other than for the fact that we're looking to expand our commodity capacity, we're also looking to significantly increase the road to rail shift. So there is going to be a significant amount of freight that actually moves off the road onto the rail, obviously to lower the cost of doing business in South Africa.
Okay, I guess another, and I'm going to use the phrase again here, end game, is to create jobs. Because when we talk about South Africa, unfortunately, that's one of the headlines we always talk about, the unemployment situation there. However, with these contracts going to American and British and Chinese companies, can you guarantee this is really going to create all those jobs for South Africans?
Yes, I think the socio-economic benefits of this transaction is one of the cornerstones of success as it relates to this transaction as well. We've got quite stringent localization and local content requirements to actually meet, and the transaction, I'm glad to say, actually met those requirements with a 55 and 60% localization content respectively. Those local content requirements actually will ensure that we actually deliver the socio-economic benefits of this transaction in excess of 30,000 jobs that will be created, a significant amount of downstream local supplier content that will be included in the locomotive build program. So as you would see with the local content requirements, there's not a hell of a lot of import leakage that will be created as a result of this transaction.
And will it be long-term employment, Anuj? Because when I think back, what are we, 4 years now since the Football World Cup was in South Africa, and you know that was a great thing to create jobs at the time, infrastructure and the like, but then it sort of fell away afterwards. Will this provide long-term employment? Because that is what South Africa and South Africans really need.
You are right in your assessment in terms of that South Africa requires long-term job creation opportunities. And the transaction, the way it was structured on the basis that it will be a programmatic procurement of locomotives over the medium to long term. So when we mention programmatic, this is the first of a series of transactions that will enable the revitalization of the locomotive fleet within the railways. So yes, this is the first chunk, but there will be other tranches of a similar type of transaction that will occur probably post the 7-year period.
As a businessman in South Africa, do you feel confident about your country's economic future? I spoke to the CEO of Standard Bank on this program a few weeks ago, and he was very upbeat. He still acknowledged the problems that exist.
I think we're relatively aligned in terms of his assessment. I think we also upbeat in terms of South Africa's prospects as a country itself, and hence we are one of the key catalysts of growth in the country in terms of the economy, being the backbone, transport backbone of the country. So the fact that we are actually taking these bold steps to actually invest in the country actually bodes well for the South African economy. And obviously, as a continent, Africa has 5 of the fastest growing economies in the world. So from that perspective, the entire African continent obviously is also quite well poised for economic growth into the future. And South Africa is positioning itself to actually take advantage of those growth opportunities as a gateway into Africa.
Do you feel there's perhaps a negative perception about South Africa? And the media is probably as much a part of this as anything else.
Yeah, I think we have our fair share of negative publicity like every other country has, I'm sure. But I think the investor sentiment and the investor appetite as it relates to South Africa remains positive. I think if you look at the foreign direct investment and the like, I think we have healthy inflows of FDI and so on and so forth, which effectively is the barometer of sentiment of foreign investors into an emerging market like South Africa.
That is Anuj Singh from Transnet in South Africa. Good talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, as we talked about there with Anuj, there is an unfortunate amount of negative news which comes from South Africa, and a lot of the time it's political. Here's the latest one. President Jacob Zuma facing allegations of misusing state funds to develop his home. In fact, the public prosecutor wants him to repay some of that money. Tanya Page with more from Pretoria.
At the South African president's sprawling rural home, a swimming pool, amphitheatre and visitors centre have been classified as security features, as such paid for by the state. The government says the swimming pool is in fact a fire pool, a reservoir to battle a blaze, and that the amphitheatre is actually a retaining wall. But the public protector isn't buying it. Her 2-year investigation into the soaring cost of the upgrades from $3 to $23 million is now public. While some of the money went towards genuine security features, overall there was, she said, an unconscionable excessive misappropriation of public funds, and that the president breached the ethics code.
It is my considered view that the president, though tacitly accepted the implementation of all measures at his residence and has unduly benefited from the enormous capital investment from the non-security installations at his private residence.
Tuli Madinsela said the president should pay back some of the money after his architect was given free rein over the project. The report is an encyclopedia of material for the opposition only a few weeks from a general election. It is critical of President Zuma, but it's toughest on various ministers and government officials who it says allowed the scale and cost of the upgrades to balloon out of control. But one political analyst told us the scandal won't seriously dent the African National Congress's support base, which sees the ANC as the party of freedom and democracy.
If South Africa had some standing in the world before the presentation of this report, that standing is destroyed. Observers all over the world must be wondering what kind of people are South Africans to tolerate a president like that. So we are actually a laughingstock globally.
While the government says it respects the Public Protector's Office, it says it needs more time to digest the contents of a report many people will find unpalatable.
Finally this week, traffic robots. Now, I recently learnt that actually in South Africa, traffic lights are called robots. This, however, is a story about actual traffic robots. Malcolm Webb has this from Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where some homemade technology is helping to keep the city's notoriously bad traffic on the move.
It's normal for drivers to spend hours in traffic every day here in Kinshasa, the capital of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Traffic police are meant to keep things moving. And now, giant traffic robots are here to help. So far, there's 2 on trial. This one directs a pedestrian crossing. Pedestrians like it.
It is better than before. Now you can cross with confidence. The robot is doing its job correctly.
The robot is the way towards modernization. We don't have to keep doing things by hand. We can change so that industry comes here.
There are a few traffic lights in Kinshasa, and so the robots are welcomed.
This robot is in the middle of a large crossroads. It's got red lights on the front and the back of its chest and green lights on the ends of its arms. Every couple of minutes it drops its arms, it rotates, and then it points the other way, first to allow the traffic to flow along this road, and then in turn to flow along the main road that cuts across it. In Kinshasa, the traffic's normally quite unruly, but for the large part it seems drivers do obey the robot.
And unlike its human counterparts, it can't collect bribes. Traffic officers are poorly paid, and drivers often accuse them of extorting money. The robot's designer, Thérèse Izé, says inbuilt cameras will report traffic offences to a central computer instead. I asked her why use robots instead of traffic lights.
There are several kinds of traffic lights in the world, but I can tell you that the only robot in human form, in the shape of a policeman who is regulating traffic, is made in Congo. We are proud of that.
Thérèse runs a women's technology cooperative. She hopes authorities will pay for the robots to be installed in cities across Africa and beyond. She says she wants to promote Congo's female engineers and create much needed jobs. And in a country where a lot of the public infrastructure doesn't work, people are happy with something that does.
And that is our show for this week, but there is more for you online at aljazeera.com. You click through to the program's link. From there you'll find the Counting the Cost page with all our previous episodes for you to catch up on. You can get in touch as well. You can tweet me at KamalAJE. There's also our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, and you can use the hashtag you've seen on screen already, that is hashtag counting the cost, or just drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.